What went through your mind, General Petraeus, when you watched the events of this weekend?
Well, it was heartbreaking. It was tragic. I don't think you can describe the Taliban takeover and their desire to establish an Islamist emirate in a country that for 20 years enjoyed a democracy, however flawed it may have been, enjoyed freedom of speech and the press, where women could go to school and to college and participate in the economy. I don't know how you can describe the Taliban taking that over as anything but disastrous. And so again, it's very, very sad for any of us in particular, I think, who served there, who have Afghan friends, comrades, and so forth. And as I said at the outbreak, it is just heartbreaking to watch. And now it's heartbreaking to see all of those who are desperately trying to get out of a country that they fear will be led by individuals who will seek to assassinate them because they served with us on the ground or supported us in some fashion. That's particularly true of the special immigrant visa applicants. These are individuals who served at least 2 years on the ground. So 2 US Army tours on the ground with our men and women in uniform, providing an invaluable service to our men and women in uniform, including my son when he was a rifle platoon leader, and our daughter-in-law when she was actually with the 173rd Airborne as well. And you know, our bureaucracy has stymied this program really for 3 administrations now. And finally, we're actually seeing the real kind of open the spigot to get these individuals out of the country, something that we should have done years ago when that program was first approved by Congress and previous administrations.
Well, why didn't we, or why didn't the United States, General Petraeus, think about some of these people prior to pulling the plug and withdrawing troops?
Well, there were lots of thoughts about these people, but of course you have to have a concrete process. The bureaucracy of these applications and all the rest of this stuff, which all has to be filed, and you have to have access to the internet and all the rest of that, in the interview process and medical checks and everything else. They were so challenging for people, and especially particularly challenging when first the embassy was hit by COVID and shut down the interview process a couple of months ago. And then more recently, when security concerns obviously began to arise, and the focus was on actually evacuating the embassy, certainly not on taking care of those who put their lives at jeopardy and the lives of their families in jeopardy because of their service with us. So again, this goes back over many administrations. We should have done this vastly better for many years. Now we are very, very serious about it and flying in wide-bodied transport aircraft to take them out. One of those reportedly had 600 people on it today, which is vastly overloaded, but credit to the pilot who got that off the ground safely and presumably has landed it safely since then. So that's what we should be focused on right now. We should use every resource that we have. There should be delegation of authority to the military, State Department, and Department of Homeland Security individuals who are going to have to make really difficult choices, haunting choices, who gets to go and who has to stay. And again, that's going to be a very, very challenging process to oversee. Obviously, ultimately, at some point, you have to collapse the entire perimeter and get out of there. That's going to be very, very messy, just as we saw how messy the situation was today when apparently civilians from the civilian part of the airfield were able to get onto the runway and over to the military side. So again, going to be a very tough process. The president did commit to that, did highlight human rights, although again, it sure would have been nice if we'd been doing a great deal more, not just over the course of this administration's 7 or whatever months now, but over the course of the entire previous administration and all the way back to when the process was actually first approved by Congress and the White House.
I read one article that said these are, I think it was in the New York Times, these are the images Joe Biden did not want to see. How should this have been handled, General Petraeus? I know you opposed withdrawing troops when President Trump wanted to do it. And then when President Biden announced that he wanted to do it before September 11th, you thought it was a bad idea. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if that decision was made, how should this have been managed?
Well, again, it should have been managed vastly more aggressively much sooner than now. I understand concerns of some kind of big evacuation that could spark some kind of panic in the Capitol or what have you. But the truth is, our announcement of the withdrawal, then the actual withdrawal of our troops, and then, interestingly, the withdrawal of our contractors who kept the Afghan Air Force operational, those were the real triggers of much of what has happened. I think there was a clear underestimation of the psychological impact of those announcements and then that final action. The Afghan Air Force I want to highlight, because if Afghan forces are all around the country, they have to defend an awful lot of different locations. The Taliban can choose where they want to mass their forces. So it's not to say there's 300,000 Afghan forces and only so many, 70 or 100,000 Taliban, and they should have been able to hold them off. Well, they had to hold them off everywhere. And again, the problem is that once the Afghan forces realized that the degraded readiness of their Air Force, and there's heroic Afghan Air Force pilots across the board, heroic special operators that were ready to go to these different locations. But as the readiness of these US provided, very sophisticated helicopters and planes eroded, the capability to reinforce, to provide aerial medevac, emergency resupply, and above all, close air support eroded as well. And I think that that was the psychological blow that triggered individual Afghan leaders and local leaders as well to cut deals, to surrender, to flee. And then that became infectious and a panic set in. I did raise awareness or concerns about this months ago. The fact that once they realize that no one has their back, we have to be very, very careful, I think, about laying the blame on Afghans who wouldn't fight, when we know that for 20 years, the Afghans have fought and died in very, very substantial numbers. And I'm a bit uncomfortable with, again, criticizing them at a moment when there's no one coming to the rescue, no one has their back, and therefore they did what was it was predictable. And some of us did actually predict that and raise concerns about that.
Did it trouble you that President Biden in his speech this afternoon seemed to suggest that he was disappointed with the Afghan military?
Well, again, they have died in vastly greater numbers than our own forces and coalition forces have. It was never a question of would Afghans fight. My gosh, they're born fighting. They're born with an AK-47 in their hand. But again, no soldier is going to fight indefinitely if there's no one coming to the rescue. They realize the futility of the situation. And the same with Afghan leaders. Ashraf Ghani gave up his US citizenship to become president of Afghanistan. He gave up his house here. He gave up a very lucrative position. And again, his withdrawal, what else is someone going to do at that point? So again, I think we have to be measured at the very least in how we assess the performance of Afghan forces and Afghan leaders, because they have fought, they've stood their ground in the past. They have died in enormous numbers. Our concern over the years, in fact, was that they were taking so many casualties that it would be very difficult to keep up their end strength, something that we did manage to do, but it was very, very challenging because of the enormous losses that they were taking. And keep in mind, we have not had a loss in Afghanistan, touch wood, since February 2020. So the idea that this was unsustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure, again, also I think is at the very least a bit arguable.
I want to talk to you about the US troop presence that you think should have remained. But before I do, were you surprised that the Taliban you talked about their ability to kind of take on the Afghan military where they wanted, but nonetheless, were you surprised how quickly they toppled city after city and then ultimately Kabul?
Well, again, as I mentioned, months ago, I said that I feared that there could be a psychological impact that in many respects would be the most important determinant of what happened. And I think that's exactly what we saw. You saw individual Afghan units and local leaders surrender, cut a deal, flee. And then others around the country, of course, everything is connected. There's cell phone towers, even in rugged Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush. They're following what's going on, and that plants the seed of that idea in their mind as well. It becomes, again, we talk a lot about infectious enthusiasm. This was infectious surrender.
Ideally, what kind of troop presence do you think should have been maintained in Afghanistan to keep things under control?
Well, we had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 troops on the ground, depending on your counting rules. Again, we had not had a battle loss in some 18 months or so. That's partly attributable to the deal that we did, very unwise deal that we cut with the Taliban during the previous administration, by the way, from which the Afghan leaders were excluded.
I know.
And we forced Afghan leaders to release 5,000 detainees, over 700 of which had already returned to the battlefield before the latest offensive even kicked off. So we could have crafted a sustainability being measured in terms of blood and treasure, sustained commitment. By the way, a sustained commitment would be the one that would provide the most solid foundation from which to negotiate. Part of our problem all along for 3 administrations is that we have repeatedly said we want to leave. And then we expect to negotiate with an adversary who realizes we want to leave and is not going to concede anything to us. We got really nothing from the agreement that was signed in the previous administration. In fact, worse than that, we of course forced the release of 5,000 ultimately Taliban fighters, and we excluded our partners on the ground, the democratically elected government of Afghanistan, from those negotiations. And of course, we never had any real strength in those negotiations because we'd already told them we wanted to go home anyway.
Yeah, I couldn't understand that either. And why do you think the Trump administration was so willing to negotiate with the Taliban absent representatives from the Afghan government?
I guess it is that the president made it very, very clear that we were going to leave. And if someone says we're going to leave, then you try to find a vehicle to enable that to happen. Beyond that, I wasn't privy to the negotiations, don't understand the negotiating strategy when you make that so clear to your adversary.
Let's talk about what's to come. What do you see as the future of Afghanistan? And how will these 6,000 troops that have been redeployed be used? And do you think that will bring some calm to the country?
Well, it's not going to bring calm to the country. It's not even going to bring calm to Kabul airport. It will bring a degree of order to a chaotic situation in a city of some 6 million or more people, probably much larger with all the refugees that have flooded into it. And it will at least establish some kind of rudimentary process to determine who gets on and off an aircraft and how to maintain security and at least keep civilians off the active runway and so forth, and from hanging on to a C-17, tragically trying to get out. We have to make it very clear, my understanding is that if the Taliban impede this in any way or pick a fight with us in any way, they'll be reminded of what has happened every time they have sought to do that in the past when we bring the might of the US military to bear. That's not something I would welcome. It's not something we should seek. But clearly I'm confident that we are ready for that kind of moment. You ask, what will Afghanistan be like? It depends on the Taliban. Is this the new, kinder, gentler Taliban? they've softened the edges of their PR campaign, certainly. They certainly want to have some countries, at least around the world, establish relations with them, have economic dealings with them, and so forth. And I think it depends on how they actually act. If they revert to the old Taliban, which was very close to an Islamist extremist regime. I mean, they do want to establish an Islamist or Islamic emirate, which is based on very, very fundamental version of Islam, bordering again on extreme. I fear that the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will certainly have an opportunity to reestablish the kind of sanctuary that Al-Qaeda had in the past. Of course, the Islamic State affiliate has only recently been established in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area. I'm very confident that our intelligence agencies and the military will keep a very close eye on that and disrupt it, degrade it, destroy it when they are able to detect that. But this is vastly more challenging, as the director of the CIA forthrightly noted it would be, if you have no bases in the country, keeping in mind that when you lose all of your operating bases for the military, you lose a lot of the so-called footprint and assets and surrogates and others that we established on the intelligence side of this operation. And now everything is going to have to be conducted from bases in Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and so forth, because no country, even in Central Asia, would allow us to reestablish bases. So again, it will depend on the Taliban. I guess, I'd like to see them again turn over a new leaf and allow women to go to American University of Afghanistan again and to participate in the economy and all the rest of that. But obviously, I'm more than a bit skeptical that we will see that transpire.
Well, let's talk about the opposite of that. If the Taliban hasn't changed its stripes, what then? What will happen to girls and women? What will happen to sort of civil society in Afghanistan? And do you believe they have the wherewithal to actually run this country?
Well, they ran it before. I mean, you can argue that they ran into the ground, and they brought in the United States because they refused to eliminate Al-Qaeda from the sanctuary that was established under Taliban control. Certainly, I fear that soccer fields will once again be turned into killing fields, that civil society will be suppressed. I mean, look, you already see the Afghans, number one, they're voting with their feet if they can. Those that actually had the means and the resources and the possibility already left. And then you saw many other, the signs of wiping out advertisements that showed women or something like that on a store. It seems somewhat indicative of what likely lies ahead, but we will have to see and then determine what is the appropriate way forward. But obviously, I don't think we're going to go back in. Again, we didn't go there for women's rights and girls' ability to go to school. We were proud that that was possible. Again, there were many achievements during that time. I'm sure you also were there, as you were when you were on patrol with us in Fallujah during the surge in Iraq, and saw all of these different achievements in so many different respects. Afghans did enjoy for some 20 years, again, a number of the freedoms that we cherish: press, freedom, opportunities for girls and women, and so forth. And we'll have to see if any of that survives. I suspect much of it will not. And I fear that you will see, again, a reversion to the past, and that will certainly not be welcome. And it will not be a happy time for Afghan citizenry unless they happen to be aligned with that kind of ultra-conservative or extremist Islam that has returned to control of the country.
Do you feel that this whole operation, as it has changed and morphed into different missions through the years, that it was worth it?
Well, I've had a lot of questions about, how do you reconcile this with all the sacrifices that were made and those that gave the last full measure of devotion, as Abraham Lincoln termed giving one's life for one's country. Look, our young men and women volunteered to serve our country at a time of war, knowing that by raising their right hand and taking an oath that they were very likely going to be deployed to a combat zone. And I think they should remain very quietly proud of what it was that they did, of serving a mission that was larger than self, of doing it alongside others who felt the same way. And again, I think this takes nothing away from them. And I'm not one who says, it all went bad when we tried to nation build. What else are you going to do? If you're going to eventually draw down your forces and leave, you have to develop Afghan forces and Afghan institutions to take on the security and other tasks that are so necessary. And that's why we did it. And it was common sense and seemed pretty logical to me and to the leaders in Washington at the time. And ultimately, we did draw down our forces from 150,000 that I was privileged to lead at the height of the operation in Afghanistan to, again, coalition and US together, certainly well under 15,000, without the country falling apart. Yes, security eroded over the past couple of years, but obviously it was nothing like what we have seen now. And again, as I stated earlier, it's just very hard for me to assess that having the Taliban take over the country can be seen as something that is a positive development from our national security perspective.
But it doesn't sound like you feel like it was an exercise in futility because of so much that was accomplished, at least during the last 2 decades.
An enormous amount was accomplished. Again, having walked the streets of vibrant markets, having put a scholarship every year for an Afghan woman to go to the American University of Afghanistan. My wife and I have done that for several years now. Again, to see all of the different opportunities that women had in society, to see vibrant press, to see freedom of expression, to see criticism of the Afghan government and frankly of us at various times. And certainly we made mistakes along the way. There were shortcomings and missteps. But again, there were 20 years of pretty extraordinary freedoms in a country that had previously been ruled by what at that time was certainly a very barbaric Taliban regime, that which rule of law was exercised by cutting people's hands off and stoning women.
Is there something that the US could do that would keep things from deteriorating? I know that you don't think negotiating with the Taliban was a good idea, but it is what it is, and we are where we are. Is there any possibility of the US working with the Taliban to encourage progress in the right direction?
I'm sure that we will. We know already, it's publicly known, that General McKenzie, the commander of US Central Command, which I was also privileged to do after Iraq and before Afghanistan, that he has talked to the Taliban, I believe in Doha, Qatar. That's for short-term objectives and to warn them presumably not to interfere with what it is that we're doing in this airlift and evacuation of those whose lives are now in jeopardy because of their service with us. Certainly, we should always have an open mind about this, but the track record of achievement from the negotiations that has been conducted over many, many years. Again, when I was the commander at US Central Command and then in Afghanistan, we had one of the most gifted and skilled and determined negotiators of all time, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, as the negotiator. I was privileged to be his military wingman, if you will, the bulldozer. We didn't make any progress when we had 150,000 troops on the ground. Now, it did not help, as I mentioned earlier, that we announced our desire to leave repeatedly and thereby, in some respects, undermined the negotiating platform from which we were working. Again, if you want the enemy to really negotiate seriously, you say that we're here, we're going to make a sustainable commitment, and you can make up your mind when you want to come to the negotiating table, and we'll figure out how this can go forward. But their idea of negotiation and what they would concede certainly has not been something that one would hold out as a great achievement.
How much responsibility do you lay on the feet of President Biden for this debacle?
Well, look, he said the buck stops with him. Again, he certainly made, I think, a powerful argument for what it was he decided to do. One can have a different view on that, obviously, and I've laid out one of those. I think it's hard to not observe that what is going on right now is, again, does border on chaos, and obviously is, again, disastrous for probably hundreds of thousands of Afghans, if not more. He shouldered that today, except that, of course, there was also a fair amount of sharing the blame with Afghan leaders, Afghan forces, previous administration, and so forth. There has been no hesitation, rightly, by President Biden and the administration to reverse or alter or refine a number of policies that were adopted under the previous administration. So the idea that we were in a straitjacket that we could not wriggle out of in this particular case is not overly persuasive to me.
You wish that he had had more flexibility when Pentagon leaders urged him to not do this too quickly and in such big numbers?
Well, my view all along, not just now, but all along, has been to take actions based on conditions on the ground, to agree on what conditions should be, what is logical and achievable under those conditions. But, to be fair, there is no good time to leave. And withdrawing from a situation like this is inevitably going to be chaotic and messy and disastrous and catastrophic. That almost goes with this kind of operation. The most dangerous operation in combat is always trying to withdraw under pressure, as they say. So again, that should have been anticipated and expected. We're certainly seeing it now, again, very aggressively right now and very commendably. There is an enormous effort ongoing to try to take care of those whose lives are in jeopardy because of what they did with us.
And what advice would you give President Biden right now, General Patraeus?
Actually, I think that what is going on right now is appropriate. We're talking about short term. His focus already, focus of the intelligence community and the military to ensure that if Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State establish the kind of sanctuary that Al-Qaeda had when the 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan, that clearly is already ongoing and will be very aggressively pursued, I'm sure. There's no way that this administration or any other could allow an Al-Qaeda sanctuary in Afghanistan to plot the kind of devastating attacks that we saw on 9/11. So again, at this point, where we are right now, I think the administration is doing all that is possible. I'd make darn sure that the very most capable forces we absolutely have are on the ground. They can certainly be augmented by 82nd Airborne and Marines and all the rest, but this is where I'd want the most capable special mission units to be the core of the military capability in case the Taliban does make a mistake and seek to confront our forces and picks a military fight. The real problem here, though, is just the sheer overwhelming mass of humanity that is trying to flee the country and that can rush any kind of perimeter. And that is going to be the challenge to the very end until the very last C-17 takes off.
How worried are you, though, General, that Afghanistan will become a hotbed for terrorism, that Al-Qaeda will reconstitute and maintain a foothold, or the Taliban could come up with some, planning of a terrorist attack? I think that's what a lot of people are really worried about.
Well, and obviously they should be. Again, this is where the 9/11 attacks were planned when the Taliban controlled the country and Al-Qaeda was allowed to have a sanctuary there. And the reason we went to Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks is because the Taliban refused to eliminate Al-Qaeda. The reason we stayed in Afghanistan actually was not for nation building. The reason we stayed was to ensure that Al-Qaeda could not reestablish that sanctuary, something they tried to do on my watch and on subsequent watches, in which we repeatedly destroyed when we detected them. And now, of course, you have the Islamic State affiliate, the Khorasan group, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region as well. So this is a threat that is, and I know, again, trust me, this is being taken very, very seriously by those in the intelligence community, the military, DHS, and so forth. And to be absolutely straightforward here, I think that our capabilities are vastly greater now in our coordination and sharing of intelligence and information, and all the rest of that is vastly improved over what it was prior to 9/11, when clearly there was a failure to connect dots that were available to share information that could have allowed the identification of what the 9/11 attackers were doing prior to that fateful day.
And you don't worry about the fact that fewer boots on the ground
Well,
will
there's going to be no
will
boots on
ham
the ground.
will ha hams will be
Absolutely.
hamstrung.
Sure. No, when you lose the physical infrastructure of the military, you lose the footprint, the lily pad, if you will, the areas from which intelligence officers can operate. You lose your ability to connect with human sources, your ability to connect with surrogate forces, to support a whole network of individuals who are trying to help us to identify the very kinds of threats that we've been discussing. So it becomes vastly more difficult. And again, it will all have to be done without bases, not only in Afghanistan, but in the Central Asian states and Pakistan as well. And obviously, we're not going to get a base in Iran anytime soon. So it's all going to have to be done from either an aircraft carrier parked off of Pakistan, which will be intermittent at best, or from the Gulf states, which require for a flight of a drone, you probably use nearly 2/3 of the flight time just getting to and from Afghanistan, rather than establishing that unblinking eye that is so powerful and so important in this kind of endeavor.
So are you nervous about a terrorist attack being plotted in Afghanistan?
I'm not nervous about it, but I'm very, very cognizant of the possibility of it. And therefore, you should do a great deal to make sure that we can identify any potential sanctuary and any potential activity. Again, keep in mind that we have much greater capability in a whole variety of different ways. And indeed, the context for intelligence collection and open source intelligence is very, very different from what it was in what were really, for the Al-Qaeda, almost Stone Age kinds of ways of operating at that time.
Kevin Barron, I talked to him earlier, and he said he would ask you, General Petraeus, why don't policy leaders listen to military advice on some of these issues?
Well, I think they listened to military advice, just as they always listened to my military advice when I was privileged to be the commander in Iraq, Central Commander, Afghanistan. The question is whether they act on it, whether they give it sufficient weight and so forth. Obviously, that depends on the advice as they view it through their prism. And certainly in certain cases, leaders have fixed views and so forth, and that the advice is filtered through that. But certainly there's no question that President Biden listened to everyone. The process was, according to my understanding, really quite thorough. It's really more about what do you do with the advice that is provided? Do you actually take it into account seriously? Not just hear it, therefore, but truly then take it into account when you're making decisions.
Well, a lot of uncertainty, I guess, faces Afghanistan now and in the future. And Thank you so much for even just having this conversation with me, General Petraeus. I know you poured a lot of your heart and soul and your career into trying to come up with solutions for Afghanistan. And I know it must be just terribly disappointing that it's ended this way.
Again, it is heartbreaking. And I think I can speak for many of those with whom I was privileged to serve in Afghanistan in describing the situation that way.
What do you think the rest of the world will think of the US pulling out this way? Will it do damage?
I think it's inevitable. This certainly does not help our credibility, nor our reputation. Again, the optics, as you described them earlier, are pretty difficult when you look at them to say this is something, again, that is positive. But at the end of the day, again, this is not, our military is not going to be broken by this. This is not the post-Vietnam hollow army. This is a professional, not draftee, a professional, exceedingly competent, combat-hardened military that is enormously capable when it is asked to perform certain tasks. So again, this is not similar to that situation where the Army Non-Commissioned Officer Corps was largely broken or something along those lines, as it has been described in the wake of Vietnam, which of course was draftee, and so you had this constant churn of individuals through the ranks. Our military is enormously capable, and I don't think that potential adversaries will make the mistake of not seeing it that way.
General Petraeus, thank you so much for your time. It's great to talk to you. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Katie.